Hello friends, hello all kind adequate people. Today we are going to talk about nitric oxide. It is a unique substance about which very little is said, but its production decreases with age, and it is the production of nitric oxide that affects so many organs and tissues, the functioning of the nervous system, the immune system, the functioning of the cardiovascular system, and unfortunately our body starts to reduce its production in such a way that by the age of 40 only 50% of the amount that was produced at the age of 20 remains in a person. And naturally, it decreases with age and thus leads to many changes that occur in people as they age. If we take the nervous system, it is a deterioration of memory, it is a deterioration of sleep, it is a deterioration in the secretion of various pituitary hormones, including hormones that affect the reproductive system. If we take immunity, the weakening of immunity due to a decrease in nitric oxide leads to the fact that we become more vulnerable to the action of various microbes and viruses, as well as our immune system begins to suffer in terms of defense against cancer. Finally, and most importantly, the cardiovascular system. When nitric oxide production decreases, our blood vessels are no longer elastic. Our blood pressure rises, people develop erectile dysfunction precisely because of impaired production of nitric oxide, and no Viagra and Cialis will help, because, I will tell you later, nitric oxide is just a substance that is necessary for relaxation of smooth muscle musculature. Also, when nitric oxide production decreases, it develops atherosclerosis, increases the tendency to thrombosis, and even nitric oxide affects thyroid function, heart, kidney, lungs. That is, there is not a single organ that is not affected by nitric oxide. If we look at the picture that represents the 12 major processes that are associated with aging, we see that there are those processes that are characterized by impaired signal transduction between cells. And the thing is that nitric oxide is just such a molecule that is a signal transducer between cells. In particular, to produce or not to produce this or that hormone, to relax or contract a muscle, to provide DNA synthesis or some kind of protein modification and so on. And the decrease in nitric oxide with age is just a very good illustration of one of the main processes that lead to aging. To elaborate a little bit more on where our nitric oxide comes from, there are two pathways. The main pathway, which many people know, has to do with the production of nitric oxide from arginine. This is why amino acid arginine, as well as its modification, or rather the already reduced substance called citrulline, is used by many bodybuilders to allow blood flow to the muscles. If the blood flow to the muscles increases, then naturally the flow of nutrients also increases, the muscle grows and so on. There can be a very good effect indeed, but actually arginine is not an essential amino acid. It is abundant, except in severe things like some massive burns, shock, or some other terrible health condition. Arginine does produce nitric oxide in a series of reactions. It is produced by an enzyme called nitric oxide synthase. There are actually 3 varieties of this enzyme. Nitric oxide synthase is a separate intrinsic system, a separate cardiovascular system, and a separate excretory system. Nevertheless, all of them produce conditionally from arginine nitric oxide. But the problem is that, as already shown in the picture, by the age of 40, especially later in life, the activity of this enzyme drops, and nitric oxide synthase is not enough to provide our body with absolutely necessary nitric oxide. And this is where the conditions that haunt a person in aging begin, including cancer, insulin resistance, neurodegenerative diseases, memory impairment, decreased testosterone secretion, decreased bone density, arterial hypertension, atherosclerosis, various immunosuppressions, and so on and so forth. That is, in fact, it is possible to express all the conditions that develop with aging, if you wish, through a deficiency in the production of nitric oxide. But, fortunately, our body has another possibility of synthesizing nitric oxide. It just begins to gain the main role after 40 years of age, and we can both increase nitric oxide with the help of certain foods, and a little bit to strengthen the actions of nitric oxide synthesis. So which way is it? Well, all of you probably have heard that there are those dreaded nitrates in vegetables. Nitrates are taken in vegetables in general in various plants, naturally from the soil, because nitrogen fertilizers, or in general nitrogen, which is contained in the soil, is necessary for the growth of plants. And naturally, nitrates are a constituent of plants. And the more we eat plants, the more our bodies take in nitrates. The fact is that even the most perfect diets, which provide for the reduction of arterial pressure, normalization concentration of cholesterol, contain a large amount of nitrates, 1,200 milligrams per day, but it is not scary. In 2008 they considered nitrates and nitrites, came to the conclusion that they are not carcinogens. Well, back to plants. In plants, nitrates are ingested by our saliva, and of course, first all this stuff is absorbed in our intestinal tract. Approximately 75% is then excreted in our urine. But 25% of nitrates which came with food are excreted again in the oral cavity with saliva. That is, the salivary glands secrete 25% of all the nitrates that we absorbed, and then the bacteria, which live in our mouth and in small cavities in the tongue, are already in action. These bacteria convert nitrates into nitrites. Well, nitrates are the compound NO3, nitrates are the compound NO2, which is the more reduced form, and then these nitrates naturally go into the stomach where they can be reduced to nitric oxide in an acidic environment. Then nitric oxide enters the bloodstream, spreads to all organs and tissues on the one hand. On the other hand, nitrites themselves are also able to fulfill the role inherent in nitric oxide. That is, to dilate our vessels and favorably affect other functions. And in this way we get an additional source of nitric oxide formation in a situation where our body can no longer produce enough nitric oxide. I will give a simple example. When a person has insufficient nitric oxide production, the well-known remedies Viagra or Cialis, which help to improve erection, even the largest doses of Cialis or Viagra will not work on such people. Why not? Because the effect is mediated through cyclic guanosine monophosphate, and more specifically both Cialis and Viagra are blockers of an enzyme that breaks down cyclic guanosine monophosphate. This enzyme is called 5-phosphodiesterase. That is, by blocking 5-phosphodiesterase Cialis and Viagra or other similar drugs promote the accumulation of cyclic guanosine monophosphate in vascular smooth muscle. As a result, the vascular smooth musculature relaxes, the vessels dilate, and consequently this leads to increased blood flow to the working organ. But if we do not have cyclic guanosine monophosphate, there will be no application point for Viagra or for Cialis. And where do we get cyclic guanosine monophosphate in the smooth muscle under the influence of nitric oxide? So if you do not have nitric oxide production in your body, then no amount of remedies will help in this case. And also absolutely in many manifestations. I just gave such a rather obvious example. And so the question is, what method will we use to increase nitric oxide? Well, obviously, after 40 years of age, the role of plants that contain nitrates is more important. Of course, you can take arginine. Of course, somebody else will still have nitric oxide synthase function, or citrulline, which is no different from arginine in terms of its effects. The only thing is that it is easier to tolerate, it does not have such negative effects on the gastrointestinal tract. So it is basically the same, it is just a different stage of the same process. And it turns out that arginine will not work for many people after 40-50, much less 60 years. Why? Because nitric oxide synthase enzyme does not work. Arginine is a substrate, it is a fuel that should be processed there, and the stove does not work to burn this fuel, or this raw material. The conveyor belt does not work to make a part out of this raw material. So you can even fill the whole conveyor with this raw material. If it does not work, then nitric oxide will not be obtained from arginine, and thus it is just pointless to use it. Again, some people may still have sufficient nitric oxide synthase function well into adulthood, but most do not, and most people should still pay attention to those foods that contain nitrates. And what do we have that contains nitrates? Well, the record holder is beets, spinach, radish, green leafy vegetables, and all green vegetables, and even nuts and some fruits. Basically, if you will consume from half a kilogram to a kilogram of vegetables and fruits per day, which is actually recommended by all guidelines, you will have enough nitrates coming with food, which will be already transformed by means of nitric oxide release into nitric oxide. And thus, if you will also be active in physical training, because regular sports also, please look at this table. Here you can see graphs of nitric oxide reduction in a person who eats poorly and does nothing physically, in the middle person in the middle, and on the right graph, in the person who follows a good diet and does regular physical training. We can see that in such a person, the fall of nitric oxide in the workup will be shifted to a later date. That is, this clearly shows the benefit of diet and exercise. In order to enhance the formation of nitric oxide from nitrates and nitrites, they are best consumed with ascorbic acid and polyphenols. One of the polyphenols is resveratrol. Well, in principle, if you eat vegetables, there is ascorbic acid, also known as vitamin C, and some polyphenols that color these vegetables give them green or red or blue color, so you are doing everything right. Regarding the caution that nitrates are dangerous, everyone used to go to the markets and measure how many nitrates are in watermelon and so on. There is such a norm, it is now being revised, that a person should consume no more than 3.7 grams of nitrates per kilogram of weight per day. In Japan they consume more, about 1.5 to 2 times, and no cases of cancer which were associated with the presence of nitrates, specifically in vegetables or fruits, have been found. On the contrary, people who prefer plant foods, they are less likely to develop cancer, despite the fact that quite a large amount of nitrates is present. Why is this so? Because in fact nitrates and nitrites themselves, which are consumed with food, are not carcinogens, but carcinogenic compounds are nitrosamines that can form when nitrates and nitrites interact with proteins in the stomach. Nitrosamines are considered dangerous, although this is also now being debated. Nitrosamines are formed in conditions where there is a lot of protein and a lot of nitrates. And who is afraid can distinguish the use of food rich in nitrates, say vegetables, eaten separately from meat. Although I believe that this is an unnecessary precaution, no one has ever proven that a piece of meat with salad causes oncological diseases. Thus, let us summarize. As we age, our bodies produce less and less nitric oxide, we can produce less of it from arginine, and more we become dependent on external sources in which our bodies get nitric oxide. These external sources are vegetables, all available beets, radishes, various leafy greens, and also in general all vegetables and fruits. At least half a kilogram, better even a kilogram of fruits and vegetables a day should be consumed, and it will prolong your health. And accordingly, if you will be physically active, you will keep the production of nitric oxide and its influence on your body for many years, and accordingly delay all those unpleasant phenomena that bring old age. This is all for those who are interested in general how to prolong their healthy period of life. Healthy without any chronic diseases, not to be a burden to their loved ones, to live in good spirits, healthy to 80 or 90 years. I have a special video course called How to Beat Aging, a Practical Guide. It contains the latest recommendations of evidence-based medicine and the ways to apply them in practice. Links to this course are in the description after this video, as well as in the first attached comment.